Hey, it's Chris at Upshift. We're at Rekluse today, and we're going to be watching them install the RadiusCX Clutch.
So first thing we're going to do is we're going to take the bike and lay it over on its side. You can either use a side stand and go off the fork or go off the handlebar. And basically what we want to do is get on the side so that the oil is not lost when we take the clutch cover off. And then we're going to start accessing the clutch system. The first thing we're going to want to do after we get it laid over is remove the brake pedal, or at least get it out of the way. For the KTMs, it's pretty easy, so remove the foot spring or the return spring. Then we're going to take an 8mm and go ahead and loosen the bolt that holds the foot pedal on, and that'll allow it to drop down and out of our way. Once the foot pedal is out of the way, we're going to take the clutch cover off. So once again on this KTM 8mm, so we're going to go ahead and take all the bolts off. That. Remove the bolts, and then that'll free up our clutch cover. Sometimes you gotta give a little extra threads there. And so when we pull it back, I just want to be mindful of the gasket. Usually I just try to leave it in place in the cases. It's either going to be in the case itself or it'll be in the back side of the clutch cover. Just want to make sure that still is removed and in good shape. After the clutch cover is off, we're going to go ahead and start disassembling the OEM clutch system. We're going to start by removing the pressure plate, and on these clutches it's a bevel spring. So these 6 bolts will be what we need to remove to start accessing the inside of the clutch. Of course, you want to be careful with any small components as the bike's laying on its side. You don't want to have to go fishing with a magnet. We'll go ahead and set these parts aside. Some components will be reused with the install of the Rekluse clutch system. Now that this pressure ring and spring is removed, the pressure plate will come up. A lot of times you'll have friction plates that will stick to the back of it. That's all right, we're going to be removing all of the clutch pack. So same thing, just go ahead and set that aside. And we'll go ahead and continue to remove the rest of the clutch pack. Once again, on the KTM, they use an OEM pin, and so those things can pop out. I just want to kind of be mindful of those. After I get about half the clutch plates out, I like to take the pins out, and then that way there's no possibility for them to fall into the engine. Now I got the pins out, go ahead and remove the rest of the clutch plates. It is helpful sometimes to have picks. So use a clutch pick like this, and go ahead and go down on the edge of the fiber plate and kind of work out your frictions. After removing the clutch pack, we're going to go ahead and remove the throwout. This is what lifts the pressure plate and engages the clutch pack. We're going to leave the throwout rod in, but we're just going to go ahead and take this throwout assembly and set it to the side. The next thing we're going to do is we need to remove the center hub. In this system, it's actually a 2-piece system. KTM uses a damper plate and then an inner hub, and there's some rubber dampers underneath of that. That will all come out as one assembly. All we need to do is relieve these lock tab washers, usually using a chisel and a small hammer. You can just knock those guys back. It is also helpful for the bike to be in gear, so you don't get it rolling around on you. Just want to knock that down about flat. All right, now that our lock tab washer has been pushed out of the way, we're going to remove the center clutch nut. On this bike, it's a 27mm. There's really two ways to do this. You can either use an impact to remove it, or use a clutch holding tool. I'm going to use an impact. We do have a clutch holding tool that Rekluse does sell. There's also some other brands out there that can help you with this step. But for removal, there's nothing wrong with using an impact. Now that we have the center clutch nut off, we can go ahead and remove the whole OEM inner hub assembly and make sure you take up that lock washer. When taking the inner hub out, there's definitely something we want to pay attention to. There's a washer that goes in between the basket and the hub, and a lot of times this washer will actually stick on the back of the OEM hub. If it stays there, you want to make sure that you remove it and then put it back down against the basket on the shaft. This must be reused with the Rekluse system. After we remove the hub from the motorcycle, it's nice to set it on a work surface. We will be taking out take off the lock tab washer and set it aside. Inside of this hub, this two-piece hub, we'll remove the damper plate. Remove the damper plate, it'll show the internal OEM dampers. For the Rekluse 500, the EXC that we're installing in today, we will be reusing this damper plate. And then we will reuse these OE dampers. So you want to go ahead and inspect them. A lot of times if these units can go bad, and what will happen is they'll be cracked on this ridge on the back side of the damper. So it looks like our dampers are good. So what we'll do is we'll start assembling these dampers into our new Rekluse hub and then replace the damper plate. So we'll go ahead and place our OE dampers into the Rekluse hub. And so we want to take note that that ridge goes down into the hub. And then you'll do that for all 6 of the dampers. It does help for the dampers to have a little bit of oil on them, which they do since we removed them, to help it slide back together. The hub and the damper plate, it does have a very tight spec. Okay, now that our dampers are in, we can reinstall the OEM damper plate. And this will take a little bit of working, and it'll fit down flush just like that. Now that our hub has the dampers installed in it, it's a good idea to go ahead and put your friction plates and your EXP disc into a bag and add a little bit of oil and get them soaking. It's asked frequently if this is required. It's not required, but it is helpful as it kind of prepares your plates for install and lubes up your EXP so that when you fire the bike up, some of that process has already taken place. So I would say that we would recommend it. It's not a requirement, but definitely recommend it. We'll take our hub that we pre-assembled earlier with our rubber dampers installed. We're going to go ahead and install it onto the main shaft, and we're going to make sure again that that thrust washer is in place between the basket and the back of the Rekluse center hub. So go ahead and slide down. You usually have to work it just a little bit to get the splines lined up. Go ahead and set it down like that. Next, we're going to install the lock washer that's supplied with the Rekluse kit. And make sure to line up the decompression with the tab on the lock washer. So we're going to go ahead and install the OEM center nut. And go ahead and spin it down. And I'm not going to torque this yet. I'm going to go ahead and get my pins and the first couple of clutch plates installed before I use my clutch holding tool. So at this stage, I'm going to go ahead and place in the 6 pins. And these are the OEM pins that we're reusing into the Rekluse center hub. At this stage, you want to make sure you're careful not to shake the bike. Obviously careful with the pin itself. As once again, we don't want to go fishing. We're going to install about 3 or 4 of the friction and steels into the bottom of the clutch pack. Rekluse uses what's called a tech plate. These are directional, so they will install either way, but you want the rotation of what we call the shark fin to be spinning towards the back of the engine in a counterclockwise direction, just like that. The friction plates are not directional, so either side, up or down, doesn't matter. And then we're going to want to continue our drive plate orientation throughout the rest of the clutch pack. And by putting a couple of the plates in first, it helps keep our pins located when we go to set the clutch torque, or the center clutch nut torque, without the threat of one of the pins falling out or moving. All right, now that we have a couple of the plates in to hold the pins in place, we're going to use our Rekluse clutch holding tool. And so what we're going to do is go ahead and locate it on the clutch pins here on the hub, and then it'll drop down into the basket. And so what that'll do is it'll lock the two units together so that we can set the torque for the center clutch nut. The torque on the center clutch nut is supposed to be 50 foot-pounds. After we set our torque for a center clutch nut, we're going to go ahead and bend up the lock tab washer. It helps using like a channel lock type plier. Go ahead and grab it on the far side of the nut, and then just slowly kind of work your way up. And then you'll get an edge, and then go ahead and flatten it as best you can to the nut side surface. I generally bend both of the tabs up if possible. Some people like to do one. It is definitely an advantage if you just do one tab, because if you do take it apart later on, then you don't have to replace the lock tab washer. There we go. After we bend up our lock tab washer, we're going to go ahead and finish installing the rest of the clutch pack. So continuing fiber steel the rest of the way through. Making sure that we keep the same orientation. After installing the last drive plate, we'll install the Rekluse auto disc. This is not directional, so there's no top or bottom. And this is where your EXP springs live, which is where your adjustment for RPM engagement can be adjusted. From the factory, from Rekluse, it's set up for an OEM idle, and in most cases doesn't need to be adjusted. And so we'll go ahead and set that down on top of that last drive plate. You want to make sure as well that the tab of the EXP disc goes into the same slot as the rest of your friction plates. The KTM basket does have like a half moon slot, which does not fit the plates, so make sure that it doesn't end up in that different slot. After we put in the EXP disc, we're ready to install the OEM Throwout. This is the piece that came out of the OEM Clutch. We'll just go ahead and set it back down into its location in the main shaft. Once the throwout is in place, we're ready to install the pressure plate, the Rekluse pressure plate. The pressure plate does have a lining plate that sits on the back side of it. What that does is keeps this friction surface from running on an aluminum surface and keeps our pressure plate from ever wearing out. So you want to kind of hold that together with both fingers and then set it down into its orientation spot on the hub, which you can kind of notice there's some indents all the way around the hub where the pressure plate fingers fit into. Okay, so we're gonna reinstall this slider ring that came out of the OEM pressure plate into the Rekluse pressure plate. So go ahead and pop it out of your OEM pressure plate. And then on this slider ring, there's some indication that says top. So it does have a top and a bottom. You have to look really close. And you'll see where it says top, and that's what you want to have facing upwards. All right, and we'll go ahead and set that slider ring into the Rekluse pressure plate. Once again, making sure that the top is facing upwards. We're now ready to install the OEM bevel spring. So the bevel spring has a locating plate that basically, this has 3 different settings on it. If you look close at it, it has a 1, a 2, or a 3. On some of the 2-stroke models, that would be an X, a Y, or a Z. The setting on the pressure plate ring is really designed for the clutch stack height. We measured our clutch stack height earlier, and the Rekluse manual indicates using setting number 2, which is the standard setting. You can go up or down, 3 being more aggressive and 1 being less aggressive. However, based on the clutch pack measurement, setting 2 is what is recommended by Rekluse and by the KTM spec for the spring work height. So we'll go ahead and set that down onto our slider ring, and then line up our mark with the bolt holes. And we'll install the T25 Rekluse flat button head screws. You do not want to reuse the OEM 8mm bolts in the pressure plate, as it will result in damage as they will hit the clutch cover. So make sure you use the Rekluse bolts. Okay, now we got our bolts started. I'm going to use the impact just to lightly take them down to flush. I like to try to make sure that our slider ring is located in the center. It should self-locate once everything's tightened down anyways. Just an extra step though. Now we're going to take our inch-pound torque wrench and torque these to 55 inch-pounds. And then you want to kind of do the star pattern, kind of similar to putting like a wheel on a car. And I like to double check it and go around twice just to make sure I get everything torqued correctly. The most beautiful part goes on next. Fancy Rekluse clutch cover. Gasket still in place there in the cases, and just go ahead and set it back down onto the case. Then go ahead and reinstall your OEM bolts, which I had set aside here. You will notice that some of the bolts will be longer or shorter. A good quick way to kind of reference where the bolts should be is that when you set them into the hole without tightening them in, they should be about the same distance from the cases or the cover surface. That's why you'll know that you have the right bolt in the right location. All right, we'll go ahead and tighten down our clutch cover bolts. We use impact, but only really lightly, just to run them in. You do not want to ram it home. This is a step where you can definitely mess up your case if you go in too tight. And we'll go ahead and tighten these bolts down. You want to make sure to reference your OEM manual for the specification of torque. They vary from model to model, even within some of the KTM and Husqvarna models. So go ahead and reference your manual for the spec of these bolts. We'll reinstall your oil filler cap from the OEM cover, and we'll put it into the Rekluse clutch cover. Let's go ahead and put it down nice and snug. All right, next we will install the OEM Spring onto the brake pedal and the Rekluse clutch cover. Just go ahead and slip it in like that. It helps to use a set of needle nose. Basically just kind of push up on it and then locate it back into place just like that. All right. Once the spring's on, we'll go ahead and remount our brake pedal to the rear master cylinder, just this 8mm bolt. Line it up and then just go ahead and thread it back in, same thing. Torque it back to the OE spec. Usually a good elbow would work too. The next step of the install for this RadiusCX system is to install the slave cylinder. So our clutch is in, now we just have to remove the OEM slave cylinder, and then we're going to install the Rekluse one. So to start, there's usually a zip tie that's holding this cable kind of together. We want to cut that and get it out of our way. Give us a little bit more room to loosen the slave cylinder banjo bolt assembly. I also like to go ahead and remove this first bolt from the slave cylinder, and this will move our, can also get it so we can move our chain guard out of the way. Now that we got this chain guard kind of loosened, we can kind of move it around out of our way. We'll take a 12mm wrench and we'll loosen the banjo bolt. And this will free up our cable. We will start getting a little bit of fluid leaking out, but since we still have the cap on at the hand cylinder, we won't lose that much. So go ahead and loosen that and remove this rubber booty. This guy set aside. And go ahead and unscrew your banjo bolt. Now once you get it loose, it'll come out. I like to kind of keep it together and just set it kind of to the side. It'll hang together like that. we'll be reinstalling it using this OEM banjo fitting. Sometimes these crust washers will kind of fall off or get out of the way. The Rekluse kit will replace those, so that's not a big deal. Now that the hose fitting is loose, we'll go ahead and remove the remaining 8mm bolts, which will remove our slave cylinder. And usually you have to work your slave cylinder just a little bit. Once again, we got this chain guard. We got a couple things in our way, but it'll just kind of work out and pop out. We'll remove the OEM slave cylinder. There's a paper gasket and an O-ring on the back of this unit. The Rekluse slave cylinder will come with replacements. If it's in really good shape, it's not a bad idea just to throw it in a baggie and keep it saved away for a rainy day. Before installing the slave cylinder, the Rekluse slave cylinder, which is adjustable, we're going to go ahead and bleed it. The bleed process is pretty easy. We're going to go ahead and fill up, just like that. Fill her all the way up. After you get the slave cylinder filled with fluid, go ahead and work the Allen back and forth, and you'll see some bubbles start popping out of the cylinder. And then you just want to keep adding fluid and working it until you feel like you get all the air out. The more air you can get out of the system for this early bleed will mean the less bleeding when you connect the unit to the rest of the bike. They have to bleed through the line. So you can kind of see some air bubbles popping out. If you hold at just a slight angle, the inlet for the fluid is just at the very inside corner of this threaded hole, and that's where your air is going to collect at. After you move the piston in and out to the point where you don't really see any more bubbles being bled out of the cylinder, you're ready to reinstall it onto the motorcycle. It looks like I got all the air out of it, so I'm ready to do that right now. So we'll take our banjo bolt with the Rekluse supplied crush washer and install it into our clutch cable line, and go ahead and set it down in like that. Our other crush washer we'll place on the top of the Rekluse slave cylinder, and then we'll just kind of hold everything together and thread in our banjo bolt into the slave housing. It is a little bit of a messy job, so it is helpful to have some paper towels kind of handy or push down into the lower engine area. As everything's kind of hanging there, we're going ahead and put our O-ring on first onto the slave housing. This fits over the piston housing. There is a notch in that. You want to make sure it seats all the way down into the back of the housing. And basically should be flush there at the base of the housing. Then we'll take our paper gasket, which is also included in the Rekluse kit, and install it on the back side of the slave cylinder. So now we got our gaskets and our seal in place. We're ready to go ahead and throw this onto the cases. Go ahead and move your chain guide out of the way and place your cylinder down into the cases, and then you want to kind of line up your holes into the cases. So after you line up your bolts and your holes, making sure that your gasket's in place, you can go ahead and reinstall your bolts that hold your slave cylinder to the engine case. Just kind of get them started to keep that gasket lined up. Now your slave cylinder has some pressure as it's going to basically be pushing up on your bevel spring a little bit, so you may notice that it's not going to fit 100% flush initially, but as you slowly tighten the bolts down, everything will tighten and get flush with the cases. Alright, after our housing is installed onto the cases, we'll go ahead and tighten down our banjo fitting. And it's a 14mm. All right. go ahead and remove the OEM cap at the master cylinder. For this KTM, it's a T20 bolt head. And they usually have a little bit of pressure, so sometimes you gotta take like an edge of a screwdriver and just kind of like bring the edge up. Go. Now we'll reuse this cap, but let's go ahead and set it aside for now. All right, now we got the cap off, we're gonna go ahead and fill up the master cylinder, trying not to make too much of a mess, which now with the master cylinder filled with fluid, we're gonna go ahead and pump our lever 5 to 6 times, and then we're gonna hold pressure on the lever. As you have your clutch lever still held in, you're gonna go ahead and crack your bleed fitting with an 8mm, and you'll see the fluid pop out, and you're gonna go ahead and close it off. After you close it off, go ahead and pump up your hand master cylinder again to bring pressure back. Usually this takes about 5 to 6 pumps. Hold, open your crack bleeder, and then go ahead and close it back off. Now you want to redo this, basically this procedure of holding, cracking loose your bleed fitting, pumping fluid through until you see no more air bubbles. Generally, because we did most of our bleeding in the slave cylinder itself, we shouldn't really need to do too much on this stage. And your lever, also when it's bled properly, will feel nice and strong, so you'll have no air and you'll have a nice stiff or strong feeling lever. So after making sure your lever feels nice and strong, ours is good, feels like it's bled all the way out. Just want to make sure that your brake fluid, or if you have a older Magura bike, it would be a mineral oil, is topped off. You can reference the top of your cap to see what type of fluid. In this case, it's brake fluid. So we're topped off and ready to throw our cap back on. The last step to installing our Rekluse clutch is setting the work gap. The gap on the KTMs or the Husqvarna models that have a slave cylinder is done with this adjustable slave cylinder unit. This is by far the most important step of the install. This is also what you're going to be doing for maintenance for the system. Basically what's happening here is this slave cylinder is going to be adjusted in to push pressure on the clutch pack and basically lift the pressure plate. And that's what allows the auto clutch to work. When you put time on it and as your clutch plates wear, this is where you're going to want to maintenance your system and basically reset it. You know, every once in a while you're going to want to check and reset it to make sure that you're in your optimal working gap. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a 4mm Allen, and our adjustment screw is nice and loose. And you'll notice that there's a mark on the screw as well as tick marks that go all the way around the adjustment housing. And so it's nice and loose, it's free, and basically you can turn this with your fingers, and you're going to turn in until you find what's called a starting point. And what the starting point is resistance. So what's going to happen is it's going to feel like it's bottoming out. And it's important to use just your fingertips, and you'll find that starting point where it's bottoming out. For us, you'll want to reference it. It's right here. This tick mark is what's going to be our starting point. Now from that starting point, we're going to go a full turn in. So there we are, there's a full turn, and we're going to go 2 more tick marks. 1 and 2. And now we should be good to go. So this is our basically setting our gap here manually, and then what we can do is we'll go up to the lever and we'll check free play gain. And that's going to be the movement in the lever to double check your adjustment is correct. So the last part of our install, we set our gap down below, and we can double check our install gap with what's called free play gain. Now free play gain is a Rekluse term because it only happens with Rekluse auto systems. And what we're going to do is we're going to hold some pressure on the end of the lever, then we're going to rev the bike to about half throttle quickly, and what should happen is the lever should move about 1/8 of an inch in under the pressure of our finger. So I'll go ahead and start the bike. We want the bike to be in neutral. And then we're going to take our finger and hold pressure on the end of the lever, and then do a couple quick revs. Then you want to let it reset and rev it again. You'll get about that 1/8 of an inch movement. 1/8 of an inch will tell you that you're adjusted correctly. If you have no movement at the lever, potentially you could have clutch slip. If you have more than that movement, you may have clutch drag. If you have either of those scenarios, you want to go ahead and back down to your cases and make sure your adjustment's correct at 1 full turn plus 2 tick marks.